Hello, everyone. Good to be here virtually for this conference. I'd like to thank Dr. Zachariah for the introduction. And I've really enjoyed getting to know Dr. Zachariah and what he's accomplished and what he's hoping to accomplish at the Oak Ridge National Lab. And it's exciting for me to be here and be able to speak to you about that and about larger issues around R&D investment in the U.S. So what I'll focus my comments on today is the book I've written with Simon Johnson, also MIT, called Jumpstarting America. The origin of this book partly was an important news event we all followed a few years ago, which was the Amazon HQ2 competition. If you remember, Amazon announced they would have a second headquarters somewhere in North America. And they announced with 6 weeks notice that cities could bid to be entrants into this sort of competition to be an HQ2. 230 cities in the US bid, even only 6 weeks notice, did the work to put in their bids. And my co-author Simon, I thought that was striking because this was in a time in 2017 when the economy seemed to be doing pretty well. Unemployment was down, the economy seemed to be solid. Why were so many cities trying so hard to get this? And we realized that in some sense, the headline economic numbers, and this is pre-COVID, the good headline economic numbers really masking two things. One was slow growth of the US economy, that the US economy in the last few decades has really grown very slowly relative to historical standards. The second is enormous disparities in that growth, in that economic growth has become increasingly concentrated in a handful of what we call superstar cities on the coast, and that really it's not been spread around the country. And we looked more into this and started thinking about this, and we realized an important fact that had not been appreciated by many economists, which is that there was a fundamental change in the role the government plays in science investment in the 1960s. From World War II to the mid-1960s, the government played an increasingly strong role in financing research and development. And indeed, by the mid-1960s, 2% of our entire economy, one in every $50 in the US, was government-sponsored R&D. This government-sponsored R&D changed America and created not only virtually every technology we use today, but the greatest middle class the world's ever seen. So every technology we can think of, from digital computing to satellite technology, to modern medicine, they all came out of the investments that were made in those couple of decades during and after World War II, when government really invested in public R&D. Moreover, while the government was investing in public R&D, it was also investing in science education through the National Defense Education Act, dramatically increasing the science and technology skills of our nation's students. So in basic economic terms, the government was increasing the demand for skills by investing massively in research and development. The government was increasing the supply of skills by increasing education of science. The result was a massive increase in high-wage, high-skill employment that drove the development of the modern American middle class. Indeed, if you look at the decades after World War II, over the 25 years after World War II, incomes nationally grew at 2.5% a year in real per capita terms. That is, holding inflation constant per person, every person had 2.5% more resources every year than the year before. And this was spread equally throughout the income distribution. The bottom of the income distribution had 2.5% more a year, and the top had 2.5% more a year. If you look at the several decades since, starting at about the mid-1970s, we've grown much more slowly, at only about between a point and a point and a half per year, percent and percent and a half per year. And it's been very unequally distributed, with virtually all the growth going to the top in the income distribution. What's changed is we have no longer pushed the scientific frontier in creating the high value-added jobs that promote middle-class growth and income mobility. Now, the first part of the book that I hope you'll read is really the history of how this happened, how we ended up being this world leader in R&D, and why we stopped, why we fell off, resulting over the several decades after the mid-1960s, a dramatic decline in public R&D, Whereas today, we spend 0.6% of our GDP on public R&D. We've gone from spending many multiples of any other country in the world to 12th in the world in public R&D spending. Now, you might ask yourself, why should we care? I mean, research and development is done by the private sector. Why do we care what the public sector is doing? Well, that's what the middle part of the book is about, is explaining the economics of why the public sector has a critical role to play in research and development. And that critical role is because of two fundamental limitations in the private sector. The first is that the private sector does not account for the spillovers delivered by R&D, by the fact that when you do fundamental science, it doesn't just benefit your firm, it benefits all firms. But for any given firm, it's not in their incentive to do that. They just care about their own bottom line. It's not they're bad people. They're just bad profit maximizers. They should be. They care about their own bottom line. So they are going to do research only that benefits them. They're not going to extend that research even if it benefits others. As a result, we've seen a dramatic shift in corporate R&D away from the R and towards the D, and away from public creation of science towards private creation of science. Corporate scientists used to be some of the leading scientists in our countries, winning Nobel Prize and publishing some of the top scientific publications. Over the last several decades, corporate publications have fallen by 60%. That is, publications by corporate scientists have fallen by 60%. Because corporations are saying, look, we don't want to share these secrets with our competitors anymore. Keep doing the research, but let's keep it private. So we cannot benefit from those spillovers. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the financing system that takes the ideas from the basic science to the market is broken. This finance system goes by the name venture capital. Now, you might think it's funny that I would say venture capital is broken. After all, the US venture capital sector is the envy of the world. 60% of the companies in the stock market, in the Dow Jones Index, got started with, in the Dow Jones Index got financed by venture capital financing. Yet, if you look at VC financing, it's been focused very much on particular kinds of investments, on information technology investments that are high risk but low capital intensity, and which yield results in a very short time. And this is because the nature of how venture capital is structured. They operate by a model that's called spray and pray. They want to invest small amounts of money, not small to me and you, but small to them, $3, $5 million, maybe up to $10 million, in a bunch of investments, knowing that roughly speaking, the majority will fail. 70% of venture capital earnings is made on their top 9% of investments. They understand it's the winners that matter. So rather than bet heavily on a few things, they want to bet lightly on a bunch of things. Well, if you're going to bet lightly, software and apps and information technology is a great place to bet. But things like clean energy or fundamental investments in robotics are not, because those are expensive, long-term investments. And you just can't take enough bets on them to make sure that you'll hit. As a result, the venture capital has been biased towards things that are very successful, Apple and Google and companies like that, but not towards fundamental scientific advance in areas like clean energy or robotics or things like that. As a result, the private sector has not provided the kind of advances in R&D that public sector financing does. And this, we have lots of evidence in the book from dozens of economic studies to support this, including evidence showing that the returns to R&D spill over massively beyond companies. And we also have stories, like the story of a company in Boston that was creating lithium-ion batteries, a very important growth sector in the 1990s when they were working on it, in the early 2000s. And they had a very successful new technology for batteries and good customers like Hewlett-Packard and Saab. And they wanted to expand. In particular, they wanted to build a new plant in Western Massachusetts, which would have employed 500 people. But US venture capitalists wouldn't finance it. They said, look, this is going to cost $200 million. We don't have that kind of money. We're not going to do it. Chinese venture capitalists, on the other hand, were willing to invest in it with one small condition, that the plant be built in China. That's jobs that the US lost to another country because our venture capital sector wouldn't support this kind of innovation. On the other hand, public investment in science has shown huge returns. There's also dozens of studies showing that public R&D complements rather than crowding out private R&D and leads to fundamental innovation that creates jobs and growth. Okay, there's studies like studies of the NIH, which show that every dollar of NIH investment, the National Institute of Health, which invests in basic science, in basic medical science, every dollar of NIH investment leads to $8 of private investment. And then every dollar of NIH investment leads to $3 in ultimate stock value and improved company performance. And there's also stories, once again, including one of my favorite stories from the book, which is what happened when a private scientist who won the Nobel Prize for sequencing DNA, and it actually already started a successful company called Biogen, you might have heard of, a guy named Walter Gilbert, decided that in the mid-1980s, the future lay in mapping the human genome. Now, at that point, this was an endeavor which would have taken decades and cost a lot of money, but he was confident that once it got started, it would happen much more quickly. So he wanted to raise $10 million, chump change, to start this company, and he couldn't. Because private investors said, well, it's going to take too long, and even when you're done, it's going to be a public map of the human genome. Why do we want to finance that? So his efforts to start a company failed. Fortunately, he and other scientists were able to convince the federal government to finance this activity. They did, creating the Human Genome Project, which over 13 years spent $3 billion mapping the human genome. Well, the results are one of the most important successes in science of the last 100 years. The Human Genome Project, the genomics industry in the US, now employs 270,000, directly employs 270,000 people, earning an average wage of $70,000 a year. And in 1 year, pays $6 billion in taxes, or twice the 13-year investment. Moreover, absent that Human Genome Project, we would not have the new vaccines for COVID. This is exactly a perfect example of what public investment in science can do. If we'd relied on the private sector, which wouldn't finance Walter Gilbert's mission, we wouldn't have had the mRNA vaccines. Okay? So basically, public science works, but both public and private science suffer from a fundamental limitation, which is that they're concentrated in a small set of cities, so-called superstar cities: New York, Boston, DC, LA, San Francisco, Seattle. 90% of all the innovation jobs in recent decades have been concentrated in less than 10 cities, mostly on the coasts. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem if everyone could just move there. I mean, after all, it's not a problem to have these tech hubs. People could just move there. The problem is people can't move there because the cities don't want them. And they've shown they don't want them by not being willing to build housing to support them. The regulations in all these cities limit the amount of housing that's available, so that the average house price in the 10 highest wage cities in America is 3 times the average house price in all other cities in America. As a result, these cities are where the technology innovation is happening, but people can't move there to get the jobs. Okay, thus the frustration the rest of the country's feeling. But that doesn't have to be so. There are dozens of places around the country that could become next generation tech hubs. So what my co-author did is we went to the data. We said, look, how many places in America are big? They have at least 100,000 working age population. They're well educated. They have a high share of college graduates and a good university. And they're affordable. The average house price is less than $225,000, which is the median in the US. We found 102 such cities, places like Knoxville, Tennessee, where there is a highly educated population. It's large so that you can really have the scale to become a tech hub, and it's affordable. Okay? Places all over the country: Rochester, New York, Columbus, Ohio, Tucson, Arizona, all over the country that meet these conditions to be next generation tech hubs. But right now they can't compete with the giant sucking sound that is coming from these coastal superstar cities. So how can we help them compete? How can we make them tech hubs? Well, to do so, we can look to a story that's my favorite story in the book. And now I'll ask a question I can't know how you'll answer because I'm not there with you. But I venture you get this wrong, not because I'm some kind of arrogant jerk, but because I've asked this question about 2,400 times now. About 17 people have gotten it right. Okay. My question for you is, what city in America is the worldwide hub, or really the US hub at least, of the computer simulation industry, as well as the largest university by enrollment in the country, largest or second largest, depending on the year, but let's go with largest. Home of the computer simulation industry and largest university in the country. Now, if you read the book, No Fair, thanks, read the book, but no fair guessing. But if you haven't read the book, how many of you guessed Orlando, Florida? Now, I'd like someone from this conference to email me and let me know how many folks were attending and how many guessed Orlando. And those of you who did, congratulations. But why Orlando? What's the story? Well, it's a great story. What happened was in 1956, the editor of the Orlando Sentinel endorsed a little-known politician named Lyndon Johnson for president. He endorsed him again in 60, held a big parade for him in 64. So Johnson in 65 called him up and said, "You've been great to me. What can I do for Orlando?" And the editor of the Orlando Sentinel says, "We want a Navy base." Now, did Lyndon Johnson let the fact Orlando's landlocked stop him from giving the Navy base? No, he didn't. He's Lyndon Johnson. So Orlando got a landlocked Navy base. It even has a cement ship out front. Well, what do you do at a landlocked Navy base? You train. So this became a naval training center, including a small battle simulation unit that had been in Long Island that got moved down to this naval base in Orlando. Fast forward to 1978. There's a medium-sized, mediocre university called the University of Central Florida with a very innovative president. And the president notices land is cheap below the university. So he goes to the Navy and he says, "Look, you've got this Navy base nearby, and they've got this small unit called a battle simulation unit, and they're starting to fool around with computer simulations. How about if we take that piece of your base off your base, put it below the university, and build a research park around it?" And the Navy agreed. Today, the Central Florida Research Park, which is 45 minutes from Orlando, it's got nothing to do with Disney. The Central Florida Research Park has 10,000 employees. And East Orange County, away from Disney, another part of Orange County, another part of Orlando, has added 100,000 jobs in 30 years because of that government investment. Most of the jobs now, by the way, in the Central Florida Research Park are not government jobs. 70% are private sector. It was exactly the kind of jumpstart Orlando needed. And that's the kind of jumpstart we can do around the country. So the last part of our book is a proposal for how to do that, which is a massive investment in federal R&D. We suggest increasing federal R&D by 0.5% of GDP, which would take us from 12th in the world to the top 3 in the world, and could create 4 million new jobs a year in the US. Okay, so about 100 billion a year in R&D. But don't just let that R&D come to the same set of 10 cities. Let's hold a national competition, choose some of that money to set up new tech hubs. Get places which have the educational infrastructure, the business infrastructure, where businesses and governments and educational institutions work together to create new technology hubs. Much like the Oak Ridge National Labs could do with Knoxville, to create a common technology hub which can become a Seattle of the future. Okay? So let's hold a competition to pick which places can do that. And let's give them some resources to jumpstart them like Orlando got. I'm very pleased to say this idea has really caught on. And there's now at least 3 major pieces of legislation, which include major new fundings for R&D and creation of these tech hubs, one of which is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation led by Senator Chuck Schumer in the Senate, but with the Republican Senate and Republican and Democrat House sponsors, that puts $110 billion into this idea over 5 years. Smaller than we wanted, but it's in the right direction. So this is a very exciting moment for this kind of innovation. We're really pleased to be part of it. We're pleased that President Joe Biden has made investing in R&D a piece of his presidential platform. He even cited our book, which was very exciting. And we hope that between his interest and the congressional interest, even in such a divided country, we can move forward on a bipartisan basis to invest in R&D. Because here's the bottom line. This is not a blue or red issue. This is an issue about growing our country. Science makes jobs. If we invest in science, we'll get more jobs. Everyone can get behind that. We need to all get together to support these kind of initiatives, the kind of initiatives we're seeing from this congressional legislation, the kind of initiative President Biden proposed, and the kind of initiatives Dr. Zachariah and others at Oak Ridge National Labs and Knoxville are talking about to move together to create these next generation technology hubs. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your listening.